But I do think athletes are held at a different level, different standard, and rightfully so because of the money we make.
There is a new twist in the Brett Favre welfare scandal.
Now, Favre is currently embroiled in a controversy involving the use of federal welfare funds set aside for the state of Mississippi's most vulnerable residents, which were reportedly diverted to Favre and others.
New text messages show the pressure former NFL quarterback Brett Favre was putting on then Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant. Favre requested money for an indoor football practice facility.
These new court documents filed by Bryant's attorneys allege Favre and former nonprofit director Nancy New, who has already pleaded guilty to fraud in the $77 million scheme, were requesting funds from the Mississippi Department of Human Services to build the facility. In a different text exchange, Favre asking New, "If you were to pay me, is there any way the media can find out where it came from and how much?"
Each year, Mississippi gets $86 million in welfare money from the federal government, though the state rejects 90% of those who apply.
In court documents and audit reports, the state alleges that the head of Mississippi's welfare agency squandered more than $70 million intended for children in poverty, instead using it as a private slush fund to benefit his family and friends.
This is a massive fraud allegation, not just with him, but it is the biggest alleged welfare scam in Mississippi's history.
Many believe we have the smoking gun that could implicate Favre. However, one of the best sports journalists out there, Mark Fainaru-Wada, the man who co-wrote League of Denial based on the NFL's covering up and disinterest in the short and long-term effects of concussions on their players, has more on the Favre saga. Recall this interview Favre gave to CNN on concussions.
And tomorrow I may not remember who I am. I may not know where I live. How do you make the game safer? You don't play.
That was back in 2018. At that time, Favre had been promoting his film Shocked, which outlined the former player's own concussion history. Also in that time,
recently I put the last 5 years more focus into concussions and mild traumatic brain injury.
Jacob Van Lattingham, a neuroscientist, teamed up with Favre to create Prevacus, a powder that is administered nasally within minutes after diagnosis of a brain injury. It is designed to treat concussions at the molecular level. Later, they would add a cream that could be applied to the trachea. Van Lattingham said the company received fairly large funding from local and national sources. But prior to, they went in front of anyone who would host them, whether together or separately, to promote Prevacus. This was a full-on wave of promotional tactics.
The brain is the most complex part of the human body. Prevacus has designed a nasal therapeutic which easily crosses into the brain.
In one feature, even Terry Bradshaw introduced Prevacus and Van Lattingham. Thus, former Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant enters the discussion. Bryant courted Prevacus, helping Favre and Van Lattingham find investors, make political connections, and he even agreed to accept stock in Prevacus in January of 2020 via the fine reporting of Mississippi Today. Nancy New ran a private organization funded largely by block grants from the state's welfare agency. Prosecutors say the nonprofit founder and her son Zach committed a crime when they sent more than $2 million to Prevacus and Pre-Sol MD, related companies that state leaders were trying to lure to Mississippi. Via ESPN, those companies belong to Van Lattingham. Favre, along with Favre's agent Buzz Cook, are also investors in Prevacus. Plus NFL Hall of Famer Kurt Warner, World Series winner and current Chicago Cubs manager David Ross, and one of the greatest soccer players in United States history, Abby Wambach, who appeared on Megyn Kelly's show. As Fainaru-Wada notes, when on the media parade, each person worked Prevacus into their answers of their history with concussions. Within months of the players and Van Lattingham's appearances on the Megyn Kelly show promoting the product, according to the Mississippi lawsuit, Favre was urging Van Lattingham to contact Nancy New to get funds from the state's Department of Human Services. Favre, the lawsuit said, let Van Lattingham know New had previously provided substantial funds on his behalf. Through current litigation, civil suit defendant Austin Smith, who received nearly $430,000 in welfare contracts, is subpoenaing the Prevacus documents as part of his defense. The civil complaint alleges they knew that the money they were seeking for Prevacus was coming from the state's welfare department. But what about Van Lattingham, you may ask?
He's a postdoc at Emory. We talked to people who worked with him there, and sort of a mixed bag. There was one woman who was very positive about him, but there were others who said that he'd sort of overstated and inflated his role at Emory. And then we tried to find people at Florida State to talk about him, which is where he became a neuroscientist, where he got his PhD, and basically nobody would talk to us.
This is Fainaru Wada speaking to Pablo Torre on ESPN Daily. Per ESPN, Van Lattingham faced substantial debts over the past several years, even as he was pressing potential investors to help get his drugs to market. Neither Favre nor Van Lattingham was charged, but they are among 38 individuals and companies named earlier this year in the civil lawsuit, which seeks the return of more than $20 million that had been designated for needy families. This is where it gets really interesting. Van Lattingham and Favre put together a piece of marketing for Prevacus. They listed Dr. Alan Sills, seen here, who is the National Football League's chief medical officer, and Jeff Miller, executive vice president of health and safety at the NFL.
Basically, they appeared to be really not associations or advisors, but rather people that the company had called. The NFL said, look, we've heard from these guys, but we don't have any association with them. We're not connected to them in any way. The NFLPA said the same thing. The NCAA said the same thing.
This would go against what Van Lattingham's company, Presol MD, wrote via the cultivating of relationships with 100 NFL retired players, and in a 2020 podcast, Van Lattingham says the company has had the support of the NFLPA during clinical trials. Van Lattingham wrote in a text to another person who would later plead guilty in the Mississippi fraud case that we partnered with the NFLPA for the clinical trials, no side effects, via court documents. While all this was going on, in January 2019, Favre hosted New and several other people at his Mississippi home to hear a business proposition from Van Lattingham. Present at that meeting were 3 people who would later go on to be charged and plead guilty in the welfare fraud case. This next part is very, very important and disputed Van Lattingham altogether. I looked to see what the evidence was that Prevacus really does what they say it does, and there is none, said Dr. Stephen Dukoski, the deputy director of the McKnight Brain Institute at the University of Florida and a leading researcher in Alzheimer's disease and TBI. Said Daniel Weinberger, the director of the Lieber Institute for Brain Development and a professor of neuroscience at Johns Hopkins, I don't believe there's any scientific evidence to support this claim for human use. As with the nasal spray, Weinberger said he doesn't believe there's any scientific evidence to support the claims about the cream. I don't believe it is prophylactic against concussions. And then the question becomes, what makes their combination of nutrient agents more effective than aspirin? Over the past 6 years, Van Lattingham and his companies have faced tons of judgments totaling more than $400K. That includes a 2020 judgment for over $151,000 to Capital City Bank and a 2017 personal federal tax for roughly $159,000. Both Presol MD and Prevacus are currently inactive corporations, according to Florida Secretary of State records. Prevacus also established itself as a Delaware corporation in 2012.